There is more to this story, because after Psychonauts, Schafer wanted to create another game he had been dreaming of. That project would be 2009's Brütal Legend, a game based around a fictional world based around classic rock and metal, and unfortunately, it seemed like history would repeat itself yet again. We've established that Tim Schafer is a man of creative genius and unfortunate luck. A man that puts so much effort into his games in order to make each one feel unique and special. Brütal Legend, both fortunate and unfortunate, fits perfectly in that catalog. I really like Brütal Legend. An entire world set in a Nordic heavy metal mishmash with unique weapons, characters, and gameplay. But if Psychonauts was any indication, Brütal Legend's existence came with a lot of sacrifice. Ever since his high school days, Schafer loves heavy metal. Growing up, bands like Motorhead, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Motley Crue, he was listening to all of them and attending their concerts. During his concert endeavors, he became fascinated with the roadies, the people involved with keeping the live show organized and in control, by tuning guitars, managing cables, managing staff, all to keep the performers and their shows looking as smooth as possible. Unlike what I initially thought, the game's scope was not all conceptualized after Psychonauts, just its core concepts were. Rather, Schafer had been dreaming and concepting Brütal Legend at age 25, during the development of Secret of Monkey Island. It would be years later, with the completion of Psychonauts, that he would present his vision to his staff, and everyone at Double Fine being more than on board to make it a reality. The first was figuring out how the world would look like. Schafer wanted most of the world to look like the fictional worlds that could be found on the record covers of famed metal bands. Inspiration from Frank Frazetta, credited as the godfather of fantasy art, would be a part of this design philosophy. He also wanted elements of gearhead and motorcyclist culture to be intertwined with the landscape, and a mixture of Norse mythology. Then there was figuring out who the main character would be. Schafer still wanted to have a roadie be the main character, since he was massively inspired after meeting a Megadeth roadie by the name of Tony. There was the idea of bringing back Hoagie, a character from Day of the Tentacle, but this was scrapped. There was also the idea of modeling the main character after Lemmy Kilmister. In the end, Eddie Riggs would look like a mixture between Jack Black and Glenn Danzig. And finally, the team had to figure out how the game would work. Double Fine had one major development philosophy, and that was to have each game be radically different from each other. This would mean that Brütal Legend was not going to be an action platformer like Psychonauts. It was going to have a whole new system of combat, traversal, and design. As the team worked, Schafer would pitch his new game to potential publishers, which went well. While making the rounds, potential publishers were put off by the metal rock themes of the world, suggesting to go with a different genre that was more popular, like hip-hop or country. Originally, the game was supposed to be published by Vivendi's subsidiary Sierra, but this changed when Activision merged with Vivendi to become Activision Blizzard, and because of the merger, several projects were dropped, including Brütal Legend. Double Fine claimed that the first time they heard that they were dropped was in a press release. Thankfully, a new publisher arrived for the project sooner than expected. In December of 2008, Double Fine had their next game under the publishing rights of an odd pairing for sure, but this was way before Andrew Wilson took over EA. And Schafer kind of needed some of EA's money to pay off the work of his celebrity cast. I always wondered where that cast came from because no one in that group worked on a video game before. And even Schafer did not originally plan to have such a cast. Well, apparently Jack Black is a massive fan of Psychonauts, and from his contacts, he learned that Schafer and Double Fine were working on a new game based around metal rock. So after a phone call with Schafer and a studio tour, Black agreed to be involved. For From there, he made contact with his friends he made within the music industry, and one by one, Lemmy Kilmister, Lita Ford, Rob Halford, and Ozzy Osbourne would agree to be a part of the project. There was another famed metal artist that planned to be involved. Ronnie James Dio was originally going to be the voice of the game's main villain, Emperor Diviculus, but was replaced by Tim Curry. It was believed that the reason Dio left was because of tensions he had with Osbourne, but Schafer claimed that it was actually due to scheduling conflicts. EA was taking a massive risk with Brütal Legend, as they knew that Psychonauts very much undersold at launch. So what did they do in order to avoid that happening again? Marketing. Lots and lots of marketing. When all was said and done, the game would launch on October 13th, 2009. Brütal Legend is quite the spectacle and experience. It has the same level of care and effort put in as Psychonauts, but on a much grander scale. But it also features unique gameplay elements that are so satisfying to utilize. You can really appreciate the amount of detail and care that went into every single element. The world is probably the biggest part of this game's experience. It's a fairly large sandbox to explore that gets larger as you progress through the game's story. What makes it so good is how much of it is filled with ideas. Sure, there are the rock formations of guitars and iron crosses and whatnot, but there are some really interesting world elements. There's the keg mountain, where beer kegs grow from the ground, providing its sustenance to those seeking it. There's the screaming wall, which is a literal wall of amplifiers with deadly ear-piercing feedback. Then you get the eastern side of the map, which is pure goth. Candles, purple and blue lighting, the sea of black tears.
It's really more of a lake of black tears, isn't it?
And the distorted trees. All of it congregates into a beautiful mass that makes metal what it is. Even this game's lore and the ways that it tells it are full of personality. Scott Campbell returns to help with the art direction. For the lore bits scattered throughout the world, he made these wonderful cave painting-like drawings to tell the story of how this world works. There are also the vehicles in this universe. They are all based around hot rod and chopper culture. Big loud V8s, flame decals, flames spitting from the exhaust. I blame this game for my adoration of hot rods and V8s. You can also tell that Campbell had his involvement due to the characters. They're not asymmetrical like the ones in Psychonauts, but these guys feature the glass eyes and exaggerated features. Headbangers have extremely muscular necks from headbanging all the time, or playing Rhombus of Ruin, give or take. The battle nuns are
Kind of sexy, though, in a weird way.
but lack any eyes and have metal mouths. Lion White embodies what glam metal was like back in the 80s. They are all uniquely designed and identifiable between one another. What sells the characters for me is the voice acting. Is it the best in the world? No. But you can tell that there is a tangible amount of enjoyment that the actors are having fulfilling their roles. Lemmy plays it off as some badass, I don't give a shit about your problems attitude. Lars Halford, played by Zach Hanks, sounds heroic and inspiring. And Diviculus, voiced by Tim Curry, well, he's loving every moment.
Sikoria, this girl, this sad human girl. Oh, you think she is the grand demon witch? The white-winged death?
And to that same level of enjoyment, Jack Black embodies Eddie Riggs. They're pretty much the same person, which is why it works so well. Plus, despite not being voice actors by trade, the celebrities' roles are pretty well done. And you got some professional VAs returning as well. For example, Richard Horvitz returns as Raz? Okay, I have two fan theories about this guy, so bear with me. The first is that this is actually Raz. When Ormageddon gets released into the modern world, he either goes on a rampage or his scream at the end makes him explode. Either way, this causes massive damage and the military is called in to assist, including the Psychonauts. They locate Eddie on the stage, and despite the medics pronouncing him dead, Raz steps in and senses his brain is still working. So he goes into Eddie's mind to try and help. This may not look like Raz, but that's just how Eddie sees Raz. The other theory I have is that this is a great relative to Raz. Rather than just being a psychic, he's more skilled as a mechanic. It's just a theory.
Again!
And the soundtrack. This soundtrack is so good. Now, unfortunately, because 90% of the game's OST is licensed, I can't necessarily share the music with you. But what I can share is Peter McConnell. Man, Peter McConnell has been in my channel a lot. He returns to provide a score that has a similar sound to his previous works, but appropriate to the world of Brütal Legend. You also have the driving mechanic. There are some races that you can do, though it's only with one character by the name of Fleetus. Though what's cool about the car... Oh, sorry.
The Druid Plow.
Or the
Deuce.
Is that it can be equipped with weapons. You start off with machine guns and side-mounted flamethrowers, but you can get crazy shit like the bolt thrower, missiles, mines, or the highly disturbing Disgorger, a weapon designed by the Tainted Coil faction that sprays blood around the sides and back of the Deuce. And in the couple missions where the car combat is involved, it's visceral and fun. Going back to the customization, there's a fair range of it. You can customize Eddie's outfit or change the patch on his back. You can also customize your axe and guitar, with their upgrades changing how those weapons perform in battle. You can also buy effigies for Mount Rockmore and unlock more combos for Eddie. All of this can be found in the Metal Forge, which is accessed through these buried garage doors that lead straight to hell. Hosted by Ozzy Osbourne.
What is it?
There is one other element to this game I haven't touched on yet, because while this is an action-adventure game, it's also an RTS. Yeah, this is the main highlight of the game. So how the hell does this work? Well, in this universe, concerts serve as a military base rather than appealing to fans. You have your stage, which allows you to spawn in your units. Units and stage upgrades can be purchased using the power of fans, spirits that emanate from geysers scattered throughout the battlefield. Commanding your units is fairly intuitive. You have your follow, hold, and attack commands. You can also perform a go-to command, where your units will go to a spot and either attack or defend a certain point. As for Eddie, or whoever you play as, we'll get to it, you can fly up into the sky, commanding your units from above and navigating the battlefield quickly. Guitar solos become a true power play in which it's the main way of building merch booths or resource booths, or calling in the abilities to change the way the battle turns. And the goal is simple. First to destroy one stage wins. It's actually fairly fun and chaotic, but still needs to be critiqued. Groups, for example, is kind of an issue. Grouping units is kind of an essential part of an RTS. Even the most basic of them have a grouping mechanic. In Brütal Legend, there is no real grouping mechanic. You can highlight a certain type of unit so that unit takes action only, but as for creating strike teams or small squads, that is not possible here. The AI is a little, well, there's a lot of beer bottles littered around the world, so maybe they're just drunk, but sometimes the AI can be kind of dumb. There's also the lack of a hold fire command, no way to garrison or create garrisons, and the units cannot receive promotions or upgrades. It's a fairly bare-bones system, but I can kind of appreciate Double Fine trying. I have always had some sort of interest in an RTS game where you can also play boots on the ground as well, and this satisfies that. Other complaints with Brütal Legend? Well, the game is fairly short if you speed through it. There is very little diversity in the side missions. Driving can be clunky from time to time. The aforementioned AI, there's no jump button, in which can get really annoying in some situations. And the game's story ends on a cliffhanger that doesn't really get answered. But I feel that the biggest issue I have with it is its world. Not design-wise, hell no. This world, I smooch it. But is it just me, or does it feel a tad underdeveloped? Like, a large portion of this game takes place around the starting area of Bladehenge, and then the second half just goes by super fast. Yeah, there's the dry ice mines, the jungle, and the sea of black tears, but those portions are so much more tiny in comparison, and to an extent, a bit closed off. One can only dream, and sadly, dreams is what fans of Brütal Legend can have. So you've got a seriously impressive story, world, combat, and cast of characters coming at you. EA marketed the ever-living shit out of it in order to get as many eyes on it as possible. And you've got the icon that is Tim Schafer at the helm. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Every little thing. It's one thing to undersell expectations by 10,000 or so copies in the initial launch window. It's another thing when Brütal Legend undersells Psychonauts by 35,000. And remember, that game had much less in the way of marketing. Majesco didn't have Richard Horvitz dress up as Raz and show up at the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards. Brütal Legend was a cataclysmic failure, and just like Psychonauts and games before, high praise from critics and those who played, but even worse sales numbers. And this had its own domino effect. Apparently, prior to the game's release, EA gave Double Fine the go-ahead for work on a sequel. But of course, that got completely scrapped, and Double Fine would not work with another mega publisher for a decade, focusing primarily on smaller indie-like titles with mixed results. It's estimated that Brütal Legend cost around $25 million collectively in development and marketing. How the hell this studio is still alive after working with EA is incredible. I mean, fuck, I liked Visceral's BF Hardline, and that game sold well enough, had a big enough player base, and still got that studio shut down. What caused this game to plunge so hard? Well, that can be narrowed down to the gameplay. Now, if this was a simple action-adventure hack and slash with combos and the lot, Brütal Legend might have done slightly better. The issue people had at the time was with the RTS elements. Personally, I didn't mind them. I played some RTS games prior to Brütal Legend, Tiberium Wars and Kane's Wrath on the Xbox 360, even Halo Wars 1. I actually embraced them despite their flaws. However, most console players genuinely dislike RTS games on a console because binding all the keys and commands that you typically need in an RTS is severely hindered on a controller. And the lack of a mouse means that navigating the map can be a bit of a strain. The late 2000s were experimental in bringing the genre to the console market, and while I applaud them for trying, I can understand why the appeal just wasn't there. For Brütal Legend's case, I can appreciate what Double Fine tried to do, and I do like it a lot, but I'm not in love with it, especially since Ensemble crafted a much better traditional RTS experience earlier that year, and that game has its own issues. Though I will say, the way that Brütal Legend's RTS came out was a bit off-putting, because with all the marketing and trailers, none of them mentioned the RTS element, except for the multiplayer trailer. So those who are just casual gamers and picked this up because of the cover or just so happened to see a commercial, were deterred by the RTS mechanics. Brütal Legend was also plagued with quite the behind-the-scenes issues. When EA signed with Double Fine, Activision Blizzard stepped in, claiming that the deal was invalid, as they were still under the impression that they were just negotiating with Double Fine. Double Fine was firm that they were indeed dropped by Acti Blizzard in their press release. The publisher sued in February 2009, claiming that they invested $15 million, that the game was still under their contract, and that the game was supposed to be finished at some point in 2008. In response, Double Fine countersued in July of that year, stating that they were indeed dropped. Acti Blizzard was trying to harm the game's success during the marketing phase, and trying to protect their Guitar Hero franchise, as Brütal Legend was supposed to be a sequel to that franchise. It was a very messy situation, and while not all of the developers were affected by the lawsuit, according to Double Fine's Carolyn as Murdoch, it took a heavy toll on Schafer. She even claimed that because of the lawsuit, it affected with the quality of the final product. Looking back on it though, it may have been better that Brütal Legend became a product of EA rather than the former. Unfortunately, I think the game had caused its own effect on Schafer, and Carolyn was right. Following Brütal Legend, the games afterwards just lacked something. They're not terrible or bad in any sense, but it feels like they exist just to exist, to meet a quota. One of the more infamous games released after Brütal Legend was Space-Based DF9, a space sim that was primarily crowdfunded. Unfortunately for the people who backed it, the game never fully reached completion. In 2014, Double Fine announced that the game would complete its development, only a year after it was put on early access. People were furious as a lot of the previous features that were promised were never added in. Now, one can only speculate what really happened behind the scenes. It could be because the studio wanted to focus on their next major project, which would be Psychonauts 2. Or it could have been something more personal. Schafer might have just been bummed releasing games that never really grasped the masses. Nothing post-Brütal Legend really shook the industry and people like Psychonauts did, and having middling titles burnt him out. Or he could have been over his own head. I like Schafer, but a creative like him has his own issues. Interestingly, after Brütal Legend launched, Bobby Kotick gave an interesting statement regarding Schafer. "I've never met him in my life. I've never had anything to do with him. I never had any involvement in the Vivendi project that they were doing, Brütal Legend, other than I was in one meeting where the guys looked at it and said, 'He's late, he's missed every milestone, he's overspent the budget, and it doesn't seem like a good game. We're going to cancel it.' And do you know what? That seemed like a sensible thing to do. And it turns out he was late, he missed every milestone. The game was not a particularly good one. While I don't fully agree with the man who still defends his company's gross mishandling of both men and women in the workplace, he makes one valid point. Schafer might have been reaching higher than he could realistically reach. He might have meant well, but game development is, at the end of the day, a business, and he might have had to go through his own self-reflection of his goals. But I don't care. I genuinely love Brütal Legend. It's as metal and hardcore as the artists who inspired it. Is it as good as Psychonauts in my eyes? No. But that doesn't stop me from replaying it or recommending it to friends. The big question is, now that Double Fine is finally providing fans of Psychonauts 2, does Brütal Legend deserve the same? Honestly, I don't think it needs one.
What a little puss.
I would love to see a second Brütal Legend, but I think it would have been better if the original sequel was being made and released sometime in the early 2010s. The current game as it is serves as a lovely timepiece and homage to the artists and culture that is heavy metal. And sadly, what made it so good cannot really be replicated today. A lot of what made it so charismatic and charming was in the performances of those OG metal artists, and a lot of them are getting quite old, some not being able to work, and one in particular lost to the condition known as the natural order of life. I know that there are some fans, more thanks to when Double Fine won the rights to the name and published the game on Steam, that would really like another Brütal Legend. To see Eddie again, to learn if Ophelia returns to the Black Tears, and if there are other music-based lands and worlds. But to force another game, it would not only be unrealistically expensive, but to me, morally unacceptable. Brütal Legend isn't just regarded as the most metal game out there. It is a timepiece and a celebration of the culture, the people who inspired it, and the sound of the genre. Schafer might have not broken a whole new ground as he had hoped to, but he created something truly special. A one-hit wonder that is unlike anything anyone has experienced before or current.